ways of seeing were central to many modernist artists and thinkers. In fact, the era of modern art, a period that emerged in the mid to late 19th century and lasted up until the 20th century, arose alongside major developments in science and society. Paradigm-changing developments include Freud's science of the human unconscious, Einstein's theory of relativity, while the Intercontinental Railroad, the telephone, and the radio remapped notions of space, time, and distance. Modernist artists explored the human psyche, the new economies of scale and multiplicity, and the idea that space-time is not separate or fixed, but instead it changes based on the individual's perspective and relationship to a given object. So let's explore the case for William Sommer.
First of all, though, the art movement. It's a great art movement. This was a period of great revolution in the history of art. And Sommer went through all of them, Impressionism, Fauvism, Vorticism, Cubism. All of those things are in his work, but blended into a very personal style in which he's reacting to local things, the high landscape, and interpreting them in his own way. I would then mention philosophy. Sommer was deeply read he spoke German fluently and was deeply read into European philosophy, especially German philosophy. So there's Nietzsche, Schopenhauer, but also the Russian philosopher Ouspensky. All of those things are in Sommer's art. I mean, he thought about them all the time. It was really central to his creative process and the way he thought about interpreting the world. Then there are, of course, lots of social and economic forces going on. We know what was happening in Cleveland. It was this bursting economic center, an engine of industry, not only steel and oil, but also commercial art, which is, of course, why Sommer came here. We were one of the major centers, not just in the nation, but in the world for producing commercial art. And Sommer had a huge reputation, so he came here. And then there was what was happening on the cultural scene, and this was an era of new freedoms for artists. You know, the state wasn't controlling anything anymore. Artists were forming organizations. Sommer was deeply involved in that, in organizing the Secessionists, the Cocoon Club, and all of these independent organizations run exclusively by artists. This was a moment of great freedom for artists. So that also played deeply into Sommer's ability to thrive in a commercial environment.
In this entire region, especially with Sommer living in Brandywine Falls in between Cleveland and Akron for much of that time, there's a lot of activity. Everything that William said is right on, and I've at times been intimidated even to dive into this period of art history and history in general because there's so much going on. So many artists are forming these associations and dense networks of interrelation of ideas and sharing and creativity. It's just a tremendously rich period. An idea that comes to mind for me also is the phrase ultra-modernist that Sommer and his colleagues would use, as distinguished maybe from just simply modern. When we think about the beginning of modern art, you can potentially define it going all the way back to Renaissance art or earlier periods. But modernist, the idea of we're aiming to look for what is specifically new and what specifically new can we do in response to our time, even if Sommer is often involved in rural imagery as opposed to sort of industrial machinery and such. He's still, as William mentioned, interested in all of these new developments in science, psychology, philosophy, and in finding new grounds for art.
I think one thing that's worth pointing out in this period, too, is just that Cleveland had so much wealth, and a lot of the philanthropists were very involved in establishing things like the Cleveland Museum of Art, which, they started in 1913, and then it opened in, 1918, 1916. So that the establishment of something like the museum was an extremely important cultural thing in the city for artists to experience.
So my next question is, and I'll start with a list of names that you all probably are very likely familiar with. Prendergast, Henry, Lukes, Sloan, Glackens, Hartley, Dove, Demuth, Weber, Bellows, Sheeler, O'Keefe, Davis, Avery, Birchfield, and I have a slide for Birchfield, and Marin. Let's take a couple seconds to look at this beautiful juxtaposition. And we'll show you a Marianne here. These are some of the top names that come up when you search for American modernist. And when you think about Sommer's European contemporaries, one thinks of figures like Cézanne, Kandinsky, and Matisse.
I love these juxtapositions. Those are great, especially this one. It's one of the things that really inspired me to write about William Sommer. The connections are just so strong and powerful. The use of this blue line, the flattening of forms, the interest in power as opposed to traditional beauty, what's pleasing. It's not pleasing at all. It's, in your face. It's so powerful. So Sommer was one of the most important artists to transmit what was happening in European modernism to America. And of course, artists gathered around him. Sommer went through these phases very quickly: Impressionism around 1910, Fauvism by 1912, even before the Armory show, then Vorticism and Cubism. And by 1912, the local magazines were all writing about Sommer as the leading artist of the school. I mean, he was the powerhouse. I mean, there were other great artists, but Sommer was. And it's interesting that he was older than most of them because he had had this long career in New York as a commercial artist before he really became a modernist in the avant-garde meaning of the word. And so you had Beeley, and there's just so many of them. One of the ones you showed, Birchfield. Birchfield, it's interesting, has this huge national reputation, widely recognized universally as one of the great American artists of the 20th century. And then you see the Birchfield and the Sommer next to each other, and you go, well, why does Sommer have this reputation?
That's right.
So anyway, I mean, the story about Birchfield is Birchfield came from Salem, Ohio. He came to Cleveland to go to school at the Cleveland School of Art, 1913-14, and then he was hearing all of these stories about Big Bill Sommer. And so he got together with some other artists, and he got on the train, and he went down to Brandywine, and they had a relationship. And this was practically unknown, even though Birchfield writes about it in his journals. So anyway, how modernism developed and was disseminated is a really critical story in the history of American art. And the Cleveland part of that is not as well known as it should be. And the way that modern art was coming in Cleveland was varied. It wasn't just people going to the Armory show. I mentioned a minute ago that people were using the word ultramodernism and experimenting with the modernist ideas before the Armory show in Cleveland.
That's right.
And you had this whole group of artists in Cleveland who were both teachers but also many commercial artists who were in many cases the sons and daughters of immigrants, and they were going back to Europe. So you had Beeley, who went to Munich in saw the first exhibition of the Blau Reiter group, and then came back with an almanac. He showed it to Sommer in the Otis lithography studio, and they were knocked out. So then Beeley and Sommer and William Zorak began working together. So there was this constant influx of ideas from many different sources, and Sommer was at the center of it.
I would say he was almost predisposed to understand what was going on in these modern movements because he was a superb draftsman. He was, I think we can't underestimate the fact that even though he was working as a commercial artist, he was working as a commercial artist day to day, day in, day out. He was working with line. He was drawing on a stone in reverse. Don't forget, if you're a lithographer, you're not just drawing in one direction. You have to flip the script, as it were. You're drawing in reverse because you're a printmaker. And you have to get texture out of the stone. You have to learn how to draw with like the side of the crayon, the point of the crayon. You're working with all of these wild colors. You have to move sort of facilely between representation and abstraction. So it's just like, even though he eventually hated sort of the grind of working as a lithographer, it made him extremely facile with all of the principles of art making. working with line, working with composition, working with color. So that once he had these exposures, even though they were often at secondhand through the, the Blue Rider Almanac or whatever, he's looking at these things in reproduction. He's able to see, oh my goodness, look what they're doing. And then he's a sponge because he has the tools. Even though he's worked commercially, he's also worked in the evenings and on the weekends as a fine artist. So he's flipping back and forth. And he's able to move, as Bill said, so quickly from, working almost in a representational way through all of these isms that you can see here and actually making each one into their own. And in fact, I would encourage you to go into the next room there and look at the paintings from 1911 because there's a scene of Lake Erie from 1911 that looks like maybe quasi symbolist, but it's pretty representational. Yes. And then you walk across the room and you see this edge of a cliff of Lake Erie that has all the broken brushwork of Impressionism and even verging into Post-Impressionism, all within probably the span of a few months. So that's extremely exciting. So I really think that I just wanted to stress that I think that his particular location, straddling the fine and the commercial art, really did predispose him to have a jumping off point. And quite frankly, I'm going to get really opinionated here. I think this guy is heads and tails above John Marin, who is dappling little bits of watercolor all over the paper. Who cares? You look at somebody, seriously, you look at William Sommer, who knows how to construct a composition.
That's right.
I mean, it's muscular.
Yes, that's right.
It's thought out. Sometimes, in the case of me, it makes you cry. It's like I was telling Michael when I first saw this show, it was like the first time I visited the Grand Canyon. I saw some of these paintings, and I don't even know why they moved me, but they obviously contained the essence of something, and that's what he was about. He wanted to convey sort of the sense of ecstasy. But anyway, I'm going on too long. I'm going to pass the mic.
That's terrific. Actually, I will just say that to Jeffrey's point about his self kind of proclamation as an ultra-modernist, and to your point, Marianne, about this kind of his dexterity within these art spaces, you can really see that in the show. And to William's point about how, in his essay, and if you get a chance to look at the catalog and pick one up, he really goes through and kind of periodizes. He gives us those periods, kind of like the Picasso periods of Sommer's work. And it really shows you how he's taking in all of these divergent forms and isms and making it something so unique and regional and beautiful. So on that point about the self-proclaimed ultramodernism and also his amazing dexterity as an artist, let's move on to my next question, which really gets to Sommer as a man. And you've kind of touched upon this, but let's get into this a little more. William Sommer was a fine artist, but he was also a commercial artist, a father, a husband, a second-generation German immigrant, and a man who liked to hold court among his friends and colleagues into the late hours of the night. So my question for you all is, who was Sommer in your view, and how did all of these aspects of his life, both the good and the bad, contribute to some of his life's work?
I think there's an interesting tension in Sommer's life between his commercial life and his work as a fine artist. And I think that defined him in a way, because he was politically quite to the left. He didn't talk about politics much. Birchfield wrote about it all the time. Many of these artists were far left anarchists, even some of them. Yeah. And for Sommer, he talked about the drudgery, the weariness, and you may know that he became so depressed he would go off for months on drinking binges. And he was reacting against the commercialism of the art world.
That's right.
Zorak said that Sommer told him he felt like he was being crucified working in the plant. And what's interesting when we look back at them, he's really a good commercial artist. I mean, he was one of the top commercial artists in the nation. That's why he was recruited to come to Cleveland. So I think that drive that Sommer had, he worked 6 days a week, by the way, and more than 8 hours a day, and he had to take the train in from Brandywine, but he was driven. And every spare moment that he had, he was drawing or he was painting, weekends especially. So this was his outlet. This was his response to the commercial world, to the materialistic values, to the shallowness. He had a not especially good relationship with his father. His father would drag him to church and he hated it. It's not that he wasn't spiritual. He was a very spiritual man, and there's a lot of spirituality and emotion in his art. And this is how he responded to things. I've often said something similar about Matisse, that Matisse, his art, he was very high-strung guy, Matisse was. And even in the darkest moments, it was his art that he found his self and his voice. And for Sommer, it's the same way. Through this art, he found his voice, and it was a reaction
That's right.
to what he was seeing around him. I mean, I'm sure you've seen scenes of what industrial Cleveland was like in those days, smokestacks and steel mills right down in the edge of the city. And here's Sommer looking with an idealism, for looking for beauty, and he created this art out of that environment. Sommer was so fiercely independent. And it was actually the fact that he was making a good living as a commercial artist that allowed him to do this work. He could never have done it otherwise. And, there's this issue about why isn't he better known? Hart Crane tried to help him when Hart Crane was in New York. He would give Sommer watercolors to the most important intellectuals of the time, some of them. And what Hart Crane finally realized is that Sommer didn't care about commercial success. He could care less. In fact, it was the opposite. It was, hot coals for him. So the commercial work allowed him to produce all of it.
That's right.
It's an interesting.
It's definitely a complicated biography. I came across a letter that he had written, this is quoted in Elizabeth McClellan's book on Sommer, that he had written to his wife Martha when she left him for about a month in the early 19-teens. And he says, "I didn't realize how much I loved you until you left, and I so want you to come back. By the way, the house is an absolute mess, and it didn't work out at all getting a maid, and my son Edwin is having to keep track of everything." But really, but he also says very sweetly, even if you're not necessarily coming back, I will send you money. I don't want you to ever have to work during my lifetime. And she came back, and they worked it out, and were together all the way through until her death. And then after she passed, he was essentially a mess.
Yes, that's right.
So, I mean, clearly she was a really strong person in his life. I'm proud that at the Akron Art Museum, one of our works, which we offered for loan and Michael declined, but is the Bordner mural, which Sommer created in some degree of collaboration with his same son, Edwin, who was also the good housekeeper. And he, of course, made many portraits of his grandchildren and neighborhood children. He was, to a degree, especially with his oldest child, William Jr., involved as a father, I understand, but, not truly present. But then these later pictures of children really come around in a really nice way for his life. Broadly, though, I understand artists best through their work, and I think this contrast that Raquel and William have been talking about between commercial work and the fine art work that Sommer is doing is wonderful to reflect on in the fine art work. There's a great quote from Sommer where he talks about what it's like to sit down on a really nice day outside and start to make a drawing toward an ultimate work. And he talks about making one line and then the next line is begging to come after it. And without really knowing all of what's happening, eventually there will be a finished picture and it'll work. This is some of the facility that Marianne was talking about, which is the underlying skill, which, as we were describing to each other beforehand, it's almost indescribable to say what is it that makes those decisions that he's making so effective, but they certainly are. And so thinking of his fine art as an arena in which he has the freedom to just pursue those impulses and then make these compositions as opposed to being constrained by the demands of commercial work, that is another way of seeing his fine art as wonderful.
Terrific. Thank you.
I do think that he protected his fine art making from commercialism altogether. And it makes sense because it took him, he basically didn't have all the time he wanted to spend on it. So if he's just having to spend evenings and weekends, and that's all he had to be able to make these works, it made sense to me that the last thing he would want to do is squander any more time away from art making to go and hustle, trying to get it sold and trying to get it seen and all that kind of thing. I really feel that it was kind of a sacred space for him. So it sort of stands to reason to me anyway.
Can you share a little bit about the Akron Art Museum's exhibition history and maybe the importance of the works on view that you've loaned to this exhibition?
Sure. First, I wish I had more information on that custodianship. We're currently in the midst of a renovation down in Akron, and so all of our paper files are off-site and stored, and we can't access them. But the upshot is that in September, we'll be reopening with some fantastic new spaces, so I encourage you all to come down
Terrific.
at that time.
Yes.
Or before. But what I know of it is that when Martha passed away, William really had a difficult time keeping up with just the basics of life. In one story, people would visit him at his house and they were leaving with paintings. Sometimes he was selling them for really amounts that were much lower than what he deserved. And so his family asked a court to step in and give the Akron Art Institute, our former name, the opportunity to take custody of the work. And he came home one day and all of it was gone. But it's all for the best. It's, I think, a significant part of the work finding its way to places like this now, that there was an opportunity to keep it together and moving appropriately. And it wasn't an opportunity that the Akron Art Museum used to acquire works. We only brought 5 into the collection before Sommer passed away. We now have a total of 64, which I think is second to the Cleveland Museum among public institutions for the total of William Sommer's work in given collections. So we've been, a significant part of promoting his legacy, and we're really privileged to be able to do that. Before we were heading toward this renovation, in the older part of our building, there was a room essentially dedicated to William Sommer. And it functioned really effectively because our collection spans from 1850 to the present, which means, especially as you go from the way we had it arranged, the older building to the newer building, there's more traditional work that many visitors who are not today's ultra-modernists would be a little more comfortable with. And then you need a way to make that transition toward things that are more contemporary. And Sommer, as a figure who is absorbing and creating through all of these intensive modernist ideas, was a really helpful artist in laying out that narrative. And the 2 paintings that are part of this show were in that gallery. More recently, they were in a gallery that we have themed around the natural world. So we certainly find ways to tell stories through the William Sommer works that are in our collection, and it's a privilege.
Could you share a bit more about the quality and power of the work that you saw when you were at the opening?
First of all, when I came to the opening, I really truly was floored because this was the first experience I've ever had with William Sommer where I saw a critical mass of his work that was finished. I've lived in Cleveland for 20 years. The first works by William Sommer that I ever saw were in the collection of Joe Erdelak. And if you all knew Joe Erdelak, he, basically bought a big chunk of the William Sommer estate. And he had a sort of office building that was a rabbit warren, and you kind of wandered through it like this, and things were everywhere. And you would see little pieces of William Sommer here, there, and everywhere, watercolors and a few finished works. But I knew William Sommer just in fits and starts. I would see things that would come up, periodically. So to see, a chronological ordering of his work as we see here, and a critical mass of it, was really sort of completely overwhelming. And I also realized that he was an incredible composer, because a lot of things I also saw by William Sommer, and this is where we can even get into the topic of finished and unfinished, but he was he was a compulsive sketcher. So I guess almost like Leonardo da Vinci or whatever, he would sit down and he would make something, and then it was done when he said it was done. It's like, I'm interested in, this horse's head, and then that's the end. Okay, I did the horse's head, and that's my piece. And it's I guess there's a notorious story too about somebody asking him to change things in a painting, which he absolutely refused to do. Because, the painting is a world unto itself, and you can't dictate that. You can't make changes. But anyway, I walked through the show and I thought that this is somebody who painted with so much confidence and an incredible conviction, but also a desire to constantly evolve. You don't feel as you move from work to work that he's repeating himself. He's striving to make something new every time he sits down in front of a board or in front of a canvas.
Right.
He's got something else in his mind that he's exploring. And sometimes, if you know enough art history, you think, oh my God, that actually looks like Gabriele Munter, a German painter. That's, that maybe looks like Kirchner, that looks like Franz Marc, that looks like somebody else. And he's kind of absorbing all that, but he's also making it into his own. And I just think that the originality of every single piece and the effort to bring it to a conclusion and make it whole in every single case. He tried really hard. This wasn't somebody who was lazy. This was somebody who pushed himself. And I'm sure that comes from also his work as a commercial artist. And to me, that was really overwhelming because there's a lot of lazy art out there. And I'm not going to name names of like all the famous people you named earlier, but there are a lot of lazy ones in that group. And I think that Sommer is heads and tails above a lot of them. I keep saying heads and tails, but anyway. And I love how his work doesn't look pretty. And I would have to say, to me, it looks more German than French. It's a little more aggressive. I love when he moves from Fauvism to this cubistic style during the course of the teens. There's an angularity to it. He's pushing the color. I mean, this one in the corner over here, this massive one that he painted for Albert Barnes that Albert Barnes rejected, I guess, for whatever reason, do we know?
His wife didn't like it.
His wife didn't like it? His wife didn't like it. Well, her loss, because it's so great. And now it's in Cleveland. Yay.
Can I try to answer this question of why Alfred Barnes rejected the painting?
Yes, let's do it.
Because it's tough. And this is what I've sort of learned across my career. The best art is really tough. It's not easily accepted. It's not just like, I've seen that before, I'm used to that. So paintings like Picasso, like Levy, and the Demoiselle.
The Demoiselle, yes.
You know what they said when Picasso he called in his artist friend, showed them the Demoiselle, and they said it was like drinking gasoline. Someone said, one day we'll find you hanging behind that. And Picasso rolled it up and put it under his bed. Those paintings were not seen for decades. They weren't sold until the 1930s. And what I've personally discovered as a curator is that you go and look at a picture, and you go look at it again, and the ones that aren't good, they just kind of become boring. The ones that are great, every time you see them, they give you something new. And that's because there's a lot in them, and there's a lot of discovery. I mean, this was the age of revolution, and artists were all about revolution.
I imagine that Barnes didn't run every one of his purchases past his wife.
I'm sure not.
Barnes had his run-ins with Matisse and other people, by the way, so... But you were asking me
about the artistic philosophy, this idea of the universal and the particular. And I have this amazing kind of the Brandywine Fall. We spoke about this in earlier conversations.
I think that's one of the most important aspects of Sommer's art. He told his fellow artist, Richard Selden, who we worked with in Otis, but also who's a member of the Cocoon Club, Sommer was always telling the artist there to seek the eternal in the commonplace.
Brilliant.
And that's William Sommer in a nutshell. It's about more than what the eye perceives. So Sommer is interested in this perception of something that exists beyond our normal three-dimensional world. It's about emotion and all kinds of things that are going into his paintings. Selden also said that Sommer was not just a visual artist, he was a philosopher, a music lover. Sommer pinned pieces, scraps of philosophy around his studio, and they were a constant source of inspiration to him. About the music, he had a player, and he would listen to the music outside while he was working, or he would listen to it first and then go outside, and then he would say he would try to paint the wind. He would try to paint the chords in the music. He would try to paint what he would hear when a bird was singing. So he's capturing all of these things, and he's trying to seek the most, common is not the right word, unique is the word, the unique aspect of something that is beyond its everyday appearance. I think he was also influenced by Ouspensky, who also believed in this fourth dimensional reality that exists beyond what you see in nature, and he said that he could see the movement of things in time after an object had passed. So William Sommer is really searching for this great kind of unity, the unity of nature, perception, feeling, and a lot of other things, literature. So you see, I love this painting, Brandywine Falls, because that's a real place. You can go to Brandywine Falls. I'm sure that Sommer walked past there many days, but what do you see? There are these nudes in the landscape, and what do they represent? What is this about? So Sommer is reaching for a kind of basic primordial type of expression, and he's reaching for that in fire worshipers too. I mean, this is the moment when people are discovering fire. They're challenging the gods. So what Sommer is reaching for is amazing, and what's really amazing, he's doing it in some cases in the 1920s. And that's another reason why I'm sure Barnes was shocked by that picture. What are other American artists they're doing to American scenes? Here's a factory, and here's old grandma's house, and the Grant Wood with the pitchforks. And what does William Sommer do?
That's right.
He's painting Nietzsche.
That's right.
So yeah, it was shocking. It was great, and it was an important moment in the history of American art.
My very first William Sommer that I saw was a drawing, actually. It was one of his Munich period drawings. It was in Joe Erdelak's collection. It was so stunning, I could hardly breathe. It was, I don't know if you're familiar with Adolf Menzel, who was one of the great late 19th century draftsmen. But it was just a drawing of an old man. And, Joe didn't even talk about it. It was just propped up against the wall. And I was like, what is that, And it was from 1890. And it was done in Herderich's class, I guess, at the Munich Academy. But I also read, and Bill, I don't know if you know about this, but do you know whether he studied privately with Herderich? He did, not just at the Munich Academy. Okay.
Yes.
But it just was this beautiful characterization, but also, just to describe it, it had these wonderful passages of light and dark, almost the way a camera sees, where you have in the light area, the highlight just basically bleeds out into the background. And then on the opposite side, it's in complete, pitch darkness. So it's just this wonderful chiaroscuro. And he drew it with several different pencils, sort of a very soft one to get the darks, and then a really, really sharp one to try to pick out like the hair sticking out of the eyebrows of the old dude and everything like that. It was just really amazing. And then with the garment, there would just be large slashes that would just be sort of the lapel and just drawn just like that. And that was it. And I thought, who is this person? And then Joe showed me the modernist stuff, and I thought, wow, it's amazing. This is where he came from.
That's right.
And when, it's hard to explain, but if you look at these modernist things and you look at his very alive line and you see the thinness and the thickness, this is a master draftsman, because to modulate a line like that, he's not just drawing an outline, he's drawing the outline, and then he's also drawing inside the form and picking out all the salient parts, all the details inside the form that are only the most important things. So it's a combination of this, meandering line that's kind of giving you all the information you need to get the essence of a tree or a house or whatever it happens to be. And he does it with this incredible economy.
That's right. And actually, thank you so much for bringing up his early work. If you want to take a look, if you haven't already seen, we have a couple of examples of his early work from 1890 when he was studying in Munich, and they're very remarkable pieces from that period. Thank you, Marianne. How about you? Yes.
Sure. I first started to think more directly about Sommer when I started working at the Akron Art Museum and came into that room that was highlighting his work through the Borden mural, which he painted as a birthday gift for Robert Bordner, a newspaper writer from Cleveland who was a good friend of his, as well as Bach chord, Landscape with Yellow Clouds, and a few other works. And what I realized, because my urge as a curator a lot of the time is to share stories with our audience that are clear as a starting point, and then which have a lot of depth behind them, I realized that Sommer was just such a perfect artist to have in our collection to introduce the adventurousness of modern art, because he's synthesizing, as everyone here has talked about already, he's synthesizing so many movements all together so ably and so adventurously that it's just a wonderful thing to be able to have almost as an introduction to our museum. The fact that he brought so many of these things to Northeast Ohio is in a way part of how our museum comes to exist and how the interest in modern contemporary art in our region comes to exist. So just how important he is for us and our narrative really struck me. I'm not sure if that's a good enough story, so I actually wanted to share someone else's, which is Hunter Ingalls, who wrote his PhD dissertation on Sommer. Like I said, I found his story of first appreciating Sommer. He says that he was initially unimpressed when August Bealey showed him examples of Sommer's work, but, and here I'm quoting, "Looking from a moving automobile at a few horses in a New Hampshire pasture, I suddenly became aware of, or felt, something I can only describe as the hoarseness of horses. This experience evoked a spontaneous flashback to Sommer's paintings, which I had all but forgotten." And then he became a foremost expert on Sommer. And so that idea of getting the universal from the particular is borne out in his experience, and it's so, I think, just a striking story, so I wanted to share that.
The hoarseness of horses. I will remember that. That is quite brilliant.
I had an inkling you were going to ask this question. What was the first William Sommer you saw? And I thought, I'll never be able to, that was a century ago. I said, and then I thought about it, I said, yes, I do remember. So it was this painting, the pool, the one with the horse, which is in the collection of the Cleveland Museum of Art. I saw it in storage, and it made no sense to me. I was enthralled with the painting. It's powerful, the color, forms. It's just a very spiritual painting, and you feel that, but you don't quite know why, because I was confused. I didn't know the artist, and at the time, the museum dated this 1945. And I said, this doesn't make any sense at all. So this was one of the paintings that inspired me to do the exhibition Transformations in Cleveland Art. And so over the years, I've tried to develop a structure for understanding this artist. I think I finally figured it out with the help of Martin Lerner. But anyway, so I now understand this painting. It's painted around 1916, 18 probably. You see on the right the painting on the back. That's on the back side. It's a double-sided painting, which is very much like the large painting there. So what I really like about this painting, the pool, as you can see, first of all, it's not a transcription of reality. You have this crescent moon, which is surrounded by a halo. You never see a halo like that in nature. Then you see these trees reaching up. Like the trees in Sommer's work are often like human beings, but in this case, they're like hands reaching up. And on the left side, it almost looks like the top of the hand is turning into a Greek lyre. Then in the middle, you see a horse, right? The horse is looking at a pool, and in the pool you see a reflection, which is what? It's narcissism. It's the birth. So you know the story, the myth of Narcissus? This Greek boy who sees his reflection in a pool of water, and he falls in love with himself. That's where narcissism comes from. And of course, who writes about narcissism? Sigmund Freud, a great essay about narcissism. So this is about the discovery of the self, its innocence, discovering the self. And I'm sure that Sommer was aware of these types of writings at the time, so there is so much emotion and spirituality in this painting that I instantaneously loved it, but didn't understand it. And I now think I have a better understanding of who William Sommer is.
I want to open it now to some audience Q&As.
I'm wondering, there seems to be a strange dichotomy in Cleveland during this era. On one hand, there was this booming center financially and otherwise, with industry and all. It was also progressive in many ways, I mean, even socially, but it was also still at heart extremely conservative. And someone like Sommer, and I know a lot of his fellow artists were sort of lauded, but also basically very much looked down on. I've always been curious how this all sort of worked, you know what I mean? It seemed like Cleveland was probably not a great place, really, for people like Sommer in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And a really great place in other ways. I guess I've never quite understood how this all sort of, this ecosystem really.
It was a very, very complex place. Still is, by the way. There were the conservative elements, captains of industry and all of that, but there was a fierce anti-capitalist movement in Cleveland. It was interesting what happened around the First World War and all of that. You had people like James Rohrheimer changing his name to Rohrmer. There was this fierce anti-German reaction. There was an anti-war movement. And that continued on. And so it's interesting how the artists kind of work around the periphery of that. In many cases, Sommer, I mean, he was not overtly political. He was devoted to his art. He probably didn't have time for it, but other artists were overtly political. And that became especially important in the 1920s and 30s. I mean, there were a number, when we did transformations, there were a number of artists who I became very interested in. One, Johann Gross Bettelheim, who's a fantastic artist, but definitely was involved in organizing anti-war demonstrations and all of that, and eventually disappeared right after the Second World War. So, right. So, I don't know if you want to talk about the politics, but Cleveland is an interesting and complex place.
One of the groups that was really, really leftist was the Cleveland printmakers, because you had Johann Gross Bettelheim and Coleman Cabini and so forth, and they really wanted, I mean, their whole thing was to bring art to the masses, so they'd have these big print markets and stuff, and they were actually communists. They were just socialists, they were communists.
I think the Cocoon Club gave, with their gathering into a strong group, gave them courage and also made a huge statement for modernism in the 20s and 30s. It was the most conservative people in this city would do anything to go to a mass ball at the Cocoon Club. So it was a big deal. I think where we lost a little impetus as a city and as an art center was maybe after the war and into the 50s. And we became a little more provincial and not the epicenter that it was before.
You touched upon the fact that many artists in this era, the Ashcan School and some of the Cleveland artists, were focusing on industrial and gritty urban scenes. And I noticed his scenes are all suburban and rural. What was his relationship to that group of artists that was focusing on this kind of gritty urban environment?
Well, Sommer had a close relationship with many of them. A lot of them went through phases where at a certain point, early 1900s, they were doing gritty urban scenes. Then they developed into modernism. And then in the 20s, they joined this American scene movement and they turned back to the urban realism, which Sommer never did. And in fact, there's a story of Sommer, someone wrote about 1925 that he felt alone at the Cocoon Club because so many of the artists had joined the American scene realist movement. And Sommer was still intent on this creative modernist expression. So Sommer knew them, but they obviously, there was a strain in the relationship.
My sense is that it has to be linked to his biography and just finding the sort of space and freedom that we described in moving to Brandywine and being out of an urban environment and being able to have that as a separate space apart from where he was doing the commercial work that he found oppressive. Something that I actually meant to say in the place of Sommer's work in the Akron Art Museum is that his interest in creating these rural scenes that are modernist, and they're not, like we sort of punched a little bit at Grant Wood earlier, like they're not about telling a story that you already know. They're about having a very direct and immediate and new, every time new, response to something rural, that you can have this modernist novelty without necessarily looking to industry and grittiness where technology is novel. And I think that's something really valuable and unique in his work.
Sommer talked a lot about the importance of spontaneity and immediate creation and the emotion of the moment. And that's why he would do something, and then at a certain point he would leave it. Can I say a word about this issue of finish? Because it annoys me to no end. Is the Demoiselle finished? A lot of people would say it's not. Look at Sommer's work. You know, he doesn't always sign his works, but sometimes you get just a structure and bold colors, and the rest is left, and he signed it. It's finished.
Here's a good example
But he's
here.
about vitality and
Yes.
power and energy. There's also another wonderful work, just the first work around the corner in the other room, where he's working on a board, and he doesn't cover up the board. In fact, he incorporates, there's a kind of oak color to it. Yeah, and any other, conservative person would say, this is not finished. And he didn't even paint out the board. Look at that.
Yes,
But it's
all
about
of that brown is
energy
the board coming
and
through. He's
power.
using that, yeah.
And then when he feels like it has that sensation, he leaves it. Don't ruin it. Don't overpaint it. So anyway, this whole idea, it was Stieglitz actually who criticized Sommer for lack of finish. I think he doesn't understand modernism.
Some of the collectors I know, and I'm curious about your thoughts about value and about merit and about the disparity between the two and about the geography. How many is it for every mile we go west from New York? We see a decrease in dollars, and regardless of merit, what's going on?
That's right. This is this kind of center periphery question. And as you can see here, there are a couple of slides that kind of compare. This is Marin on the left, New York's Abstraction, and Brandywine in Winter by Sommer. What do you all think about this question of merit and value?
Well, I think that the two can absolutely be independent of one another in many cases. I think that the geographic assessment, maybe I'll leave that for my colleagues here, but I've been wanting to read this quote from Hunter Ingalls, which I think works really well. He says, "In my opinion, the chief reason why the extraordinary qualities of William Sommer's work have not been recognized is that the majority of people, scholars and casual gallery visitors alike, respond to art through conditioned reflexes." And this gets to the difficulty that William was talking about, that when or the novelty in each work that Marianne was talking about, when you're trying to make each work anew and when you're synthesizing many movements at once and it's not recognizably immediately,
Yes.
oh, this falls into this category, that category, that makes it harder. And you have to actually look. And I think when I look at this work, I love the legibility of decision making in a lot of it. You can see that he's really intentional with line and composition and color. And you can sort of unpack the thought that went into each piece of a picture. And it's so satisfying. And so eventually Ingalls comes to a conclusion saying, what's to be done with these works is to enjoy them, communicate with them, experience them. The heart of this experience is simple, intuitive response to line and color. The wiry strength of Sommer's line and the lyrical sensitivity of his color really need no apologies or explanations. So you have to be comfortable with that and just with the experience of really enjoying a work of art. And I think we can all pat ourselves on the back if we do some of that this evening. But that doesn't necessarily yield the sort of easy contextualization that may drive up value.
So if you can see at the bottom, this piece brought in a price point of $688,000, And here, this Brandy Wine in Winter, which is in this show, is priced at $37,500. What do you think about this, Marianne?
I have to say that it's so difficult to catch up because had he promoted himself
That's right.
at the time, had he listened to Hart Crane and the others,
And William Zurich, yes.
right, at the time, he could have established a benchmark. It's so hard after the fact, especially if he didn't have a New York dealer. Because if you look at somebody like Carl Gertner, who actually did have Macbeth, who was promoting him at the time and getting stronger prices for him, he was doing better. But I think it's just hard to play catch up.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to say. Now, Michael, if you were in New York, I don't know, maybe.
We're getting there.
You're getting there. It's just,
I'm gonna fall off the conveyor belt before I get there.
It looks like we have a hand in the back, yes.
So my sense is if Sommer had had an Alfred Stieglitz
That's right.
supporting him,
That's right.
we would be seeing a lot more zeros at the end of his numbers. And it all was a function of those years that Stieglitz was promoting his group.
That's right.
And for whatever reason, the fact that Sommer didn't have an interest in doing that, but continued to just concentrate on his art, made a huge difference in the long run.
I think you've answered that precisely well. Like, that is so perfect. He was, one, not interested in self-promotion, and two, Stieglitz, individuals like Stieglitz and even the critic Hilton Kramer didn't have access to his full body of work. So a couple of the pieces they were seeing, they didn't get it. But in the context of a show like this, let's say looking at 121 works, you get it. Yeah. And so these individuals were seeing so much work in New York City in these centers of concentrated market value, concentrated art center, and they just didn't get it. They didn't see the full body of work. So I think that's a really brilliant point you're making.
He wasn't packaged with the other, like another group of modernists. So like, if you had Bealey and Sommer and so forth,
That's right.
In the way that Stieglitz had his circle,
Right.
It would have made a big difference.
So also to Jeffrey's point, he was hard to package. He wasn't doing one thing. Yes.
Yeah, I think another thing is exposure. It's one thing you'll see one Bill Summers and someone like Hilton Kramer, as you were saying, I don't think really understood or have seen a lot of Summers' work. You see one thing here, doesn't quite make sense. When you see it as a group here, it's so impressive.
That's right.
You get a really sense of the development, the different periods and what they meant. And I don't think he's had that kind of exposure nationally that he should have.
Talking about exposure, is there a plan for this exhibit to travel anywhere else?
So great.
I'll shoot that back to Michael. Well, yes, it's not conceived as a traveling show, but I've heard that comment several times.
We're going to look at turning your fabulous catalog, Bill, so much credit goes to you, into a monograph.
Okay.
Which then, it takes so much time, especially for a museum that moves in such a glacial way, to really forget getting a group to decide, well, this, years go by. But with the monograph and also some of these bigger galleries now basically doing museum shows faster and better than the museums, I think it'll be crushing logic to some of them that something needs to be done. And the luck we've had here, it should be acknowledged that this madman named Lerner, who came to Cleveland under Sherman Lee as a young curator, fell in love with an Asian curator, fell in love with William Sommer's work immediately, and for 60 years, throughout his 35-year career as the senior Asian curator at the Metropolitan Museum, throughout those 60 years, he continued to collect William Sommer, and therefore there was critical mass enough for us to put together this exhibition. Otherwise, it would have been dispersed everywhere, and it would have been such an almost insurmountable challenge. So here we are.
And a very big thanks to Wolf and the Wolf's team for all of the hard work. Please join us for refreshments and hors d'oeuvres in the lounge. Thank you so much, everyone.